Picture this. It's September 1221, and somewhere in a narrow valley car between the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains, something impossible is happening. The sound of thundering hooves echoes off canyon walls. Men are screaming. Steel clashes against steel. For the first time in 15 years of conquest, for the first time since Genghis Khan proclaimed himself ruler of all Mongols, the unthinkable is unfolding. The Mongol army, the most feared military force the medieval world had ever seen, is running. Not retreating tactically, not regrouping, but running in pure, desperate panic. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Mongols, the guys who swept through China, who obliterated civilizations, who turned entire cities into ash and rubble, those Mongols are running. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And before we're done here, you're going to understand how one desperate prince, leading what was essentially a ragtag army of refugees and mountain tribesmen, pulled off what might be the most stunning upset in medieval military history. But here's the thing about Parwan that most history channels won't tell you. This wasn't just a battle. This was the day pride met metal. This was the day the unstoppable force discovered it wasn't so unstoppable after all. The aftermath is where the story gets really interesting. Sometimes, winning a battle is just the beginning of losing a war. By 1221, the Mongol war machine had been rampaging across Central Asia for 2 years. The Khwarazmian Empire, one of the most powerful Muslim states of its time, had basically ceased to exist. Bokhara was burned. Samarkand was conquered. Nishapur, don't even get me started, was destroyed so thoroughly that reportedly every living thing, down to cats and dogs, was slaughtered. The Shah himself had died alone and destitute on an island in the Caspian Sea, probably wondering where it all went wrong. Into this apocalypse steps our protagonist, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu. If you were writing a movie script, you couldn't create a better underdog hero. Son of the dead Shah, born to a slave woman, overlooked for succession, but possessing something his legitimate brothers didn't, actual military talent. While the empire crumbled around him, while cities surrendered without a fight, while nobles fled in every direction, Jalal did something audacious. He stood his ground. So, how does a refugee prince with a hastily assembled army defeat 30,000 Mongol cavalry in open battle? How does he hand Genghis Khan his most humiliating defeat? And here's the real question. If he won so decisively at Parwan, why isn't he remembered as the man who stopped the Mongols? Stick around, because this story has more twists than a Game of Thrones episode. And unlike Game of Thrones, this ending actually makes sense. To appreciate Jalal al-Din's victory, you need to understand what he was up against. The Mongols in 1221 weren't just another nomadic tribe on horseback. They were the most sophisticated military organization on the planet, bar none. Genghis Khan had spent 20 years perfecting a system that made every other contemporary army look like a medieval Renaissance fair. His forces operated on a decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Every soldier knew exactly where he fit in the hierarchy. Communication was instantaneous by medieval standards, using flag signals, smoke, and mounted couriers who could ride 100 kilometers in a single day. Their logistics were meticulous, far ahead of European knights still struggling to coordinate a simple cavalry charge. Their equipment was cutting edge. Composite bows could shoot 300 meters and penetrate most armor of the period. Each warrior carried 2 or 3 bows and 60 arrows, and could fire from horseback at full gallop with terrifying accuracy. Mongol tactics were revolutionary. Feigned retreats, pincer movements, and psychological warfare on an industrial scale. They'd been practicing these methods since childhood. It was literally bred into them. Here's a stat that should terrify you. From 1206, when Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes, to September 1221, they hadn't lost a single major pitched battle. Not one. 15 years of continuous warfare across Asia, and their record was spotless. Cities fell, armies crumbled, empires collapsed. The Mongols just kept winning. The man leading the Mongol forces at Parwan was Shigi Katuku. This wasn't a battle-hardened general. Shigi was Genghis Khan's adopted son, a scholar and administrator, one of the first Mongols to learn to read and write. He had been instrumental in codifying Mongol law. Commanding 30,000 troops in enemy territory, however, was not exactly his specialty. This is where Genghis made his first mistake. The Khan had just spent 2 years systematically dismantling the Khwarazmian Empire. He had crushed every army in his path. The Shah Muhammad was dead, the empire shattered. Hunting down Jalal al-Din was, in Genghis's mind, merely cleanup duty. He sent Shigi with 30,000 men. Sounds like a lot, until you realize the main Mongol army had over 100,000 warriors. He had basically sent the B team. What really worked against Shigi, though, was overconfidence. He had watched the Mongols steamroll everything in their path for 15 years. Bukharan armies fell in 3 days. Samarkand surrendered in 5. Why would a refugee prince with a ragtag army be any different? Overconfidence is a powerful drug, and Shigi was high on it. What Shigi didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Jalal al-Din wasn't some pampered prince playing soldier. This man had been fighting alongside his father since he was a child. He had commanded forces before, and he was about to turn a desperate, underpowered army into the nightmare of a lifetime for the Mongols. He understood Mongol tactics because he had studied them. He had watched them destroy his empire, and he had learned. Now, in the summer of 1221, holed up in the fortress city of Ghazni, he was planning something audacious. But before we get to the battle itself, you need to understand who was actually going to fight this thing. The coalition Jalal assembled was nothing short of remarkable. And the question we need to ask ourselves is this: was he a brilliant strategist setting a trap, or a desperate man making a last stand? Honestly, the answer is both. The summer of 1221 in Ghazni was a time of contradictions. The city was swelling with refugees, all carrying stories of Mongol atrocities. Families torn apart, cities reduced to rubble, the kind of trauma that either breaks you or forges you into something harder. And Jalal was doing something that shouldn't have been possible. He was building an army out of broken pieces. The core of his force was what remained of the Khwarazmian military, professional soldiers, cavalry, men who had served under his father, maybe 10,000 of them. Not terrible, but nowhere near enough. Then there were the Turks, led by Amin Malik, Jalal's father-in-law, another solid contingent. But here's where it gets interesting. Word had spread about what happened at Bamiyan. The Mongols had suffered a casualty there. Genghis Khan's grandson was killed by a defender's arrow. In retaliation, the Khan had ordered every living thing in the city killed. People, animals, plants. They salted the earth. They called it the City of Sorrows. That news hit Afghanistan like an electric shock. Suddenly, 30,000 Afghan warriors descended from the mountains. These were tribesmen, highlanders who knew every pass and valley in Hindu Kush. They weren't professional soldiers. Some of them probably fought with weapons their grandfathers had used. But they had something money can't buy: a reason to fight. This was their homeland, and they had seen what surrender meant. Here's what fascinates me about Jalal's strategy. He knew, absolutely knew, that he couldn't beat the Mongols on open ground. That would have been suicide. The Mongols excelled in open field combat, where their cavalry could maneuver freely. That was where they wanted you, and where they had killed every army foolish enough to face them. Jalal made a decision that would define the entire battle. He wasn't going to give them what they wanted. He chose Parwan. If you've never been to Afghanistan, it's worth understanding what this terrain is like. The Hindu Kush isn't gentle rolling hills. These are serious mountains, carved with narrow valleys where the sun barely touches the ground. Parwan was perfect. A valley maybe a few hundred meters wide, hemmed in by cliffs on both sides. Numerical superiority mattered less here, and local knowledge mattered everything. Jalal positioned his forces with the precision of a chess grandmaster. His infantry took the high ground to rain arrows down. His cavalry waited for the right moment to strike. Most importantly, he ensured the Mongols would have to come to him through that narrow valley, neutralizing their legendary mobility. It was brilliant, but also desperate. If this didn't work, there was nowhere left to run. When Shigi Katuku got word that Jalal was gathering forces at Parwan, he made his second mistake. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He didn't scout the terrain properly. He just marched his 30,000 cavalry straight into the valley, probably thinking the battle would be over by sunset. After all, What could defeated prince and a bunch of mountain tribesmen do against the most feared army in the world? The valley waited silently, the summer heat shimmering in the air. Somewhere between those rock walls, nearly 100,000 men were about to collide in one of the most stunning battles of the medieval period. And absolutely nobody, not Shigi, not Genghis Khan, probably not even Jalal himself, expected what was about to happen. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. All that remained was to spring it. The first 2 days of the battle were a chess match. Shigi probed the Khwarazmian positions, trying to find a weakness. But Jalal's forces were perfectly positioned. Every Mongol probe ran into prepared defenses. Arrows rained from the heights, and the narrow valley prevented the Mongols from using their numerical advantage effectively. It must have been frustrating for Shigi. Nothing in his experience, nothing in Mongol doctrine, had prepared him for an enemy who refused a chase, who wouldn't be drawn out, who understood patience as a weapon. On the second day, Shigi tried something clever. He mounted straw dummies on spare horses to make his force look larger, a classic Mongol tactic designed to intimidate and force mistakes. And it probably should have worked. Most commanders of the era would have fallen for it. But Jalal wasn't most commanders. He had been fighting alongside his father for years. He studied the straw warriors and didn't blink. If anything, it told him something important. Shigi was getting desperate. The third day dawned with tension you could cut with a sword. Both sides knew this had to end. The Mongols couldn't linger in the valley forever, and Jalal couldn't sustain his coalition without a decisive result. Something had to break. That's when Shigi made his fatal mistake. He committed to a full assault. The Mongol right flank charged straight at the division commanded by Jalal, the Afghan leader. Now you have to understand the psychology at play. The Mongols were fearless conquerors, but here, in this narrow valley, they were about to discover that even the most disciplined warriors could be outmaneuvered and outsmarted by sheer determination, intimate knowledge of terrain, and a leader who refused to fight on the enemy's terms. The Afghans had never faced the Mongols in open battle before. Most of them were probably terrified, wondering if they'd made a colossal mistake coming down from their mountains. When that wave of Mongol cavalry came thundering toward them, every instinct must have screamed to run. But Jalal held his position. His men stood their ground and fired from a standing position, exactly as he had ordered. The Mongols, following their standard playbook, executed a feigned retreat. It was textbook stuff. They had done it 1,000 times. You charge, the enemy shoots. You pretend to run. The enemy chases in disorder. Then you wheel around and destroy them. Easy. And here's where it turned tragic. 500 of Jalal's men couldn't resist. They saw the Mongols running, and every warrior instinct told them to pursue. They broke ranks and chased. Right on schedule, the Mongols turned and slaughtered all 500. For a moment, it must have looked as though the battle was going exactly as Shigi expected. The enemy was breaking, and victory seemed at hand. Except Jalal had been watching and waiting. He saw his moment. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Jalal personally led a charge straight into the Mongol center. Not with his full force, but with his elite cavalry, his best men, the warriors who had been with him from the start. He struck the Mongols at their most vulnerable point, just as they were celebrating the kill of those 500 men. The impact was devastating. Jalal crashed into the Mongol formation like a hammer, and suddenly the dynamic of the battle shifted. Remember, these Mongols were packed into a narrow valley. They couldn't maneuver. Their famous pincer movements and feigned retreats were useless. Their greatest advantage, mobility, had become a liability. The geography Jalal had chosen paid off in spades. Forces on the heights rained arrows down into the packed Mongol ranks. The narrow valley became a killing zone. The Mongols were hit from the front, above, and the sides. They tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. They tried to charge, but they were hemmed in. For the first time in their careers, these veteran warriors found themselves in a position where skill and discipline didn't matter. They were trapped. Picture this moment. Mongol warriors, who had conquered half of Asia, had never lost. Now they watched their formations disintegrate. Brothers fell around them. Commanders shouted orders that could not be executed. For the first time in their lives, they felt something they had never felt before: fear. Jalal must have seen it, too, that instant when the enemy's eyes change, when confidence becomes doubt, and doubt becomes terror. He shouted orders for a general advance. Every Khwarazmian Turk and Afghan warrior who had been waiting, watching their comrades die, and holding their positions now charged. All at once, the Mongol formation collapsed. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The cavalry, packed together and unable to maneuver, began to break. Not a tactical retreat. Break. Panic set in. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Some tried to surrender. Others tried to fight their way out. It didn't matter. The valley had become a slaughterhouse. Jalal's forces pursued relentlessly. These were men who had seen their cities burned and their families killed. They had heard the stories from the Shaper and Bokhara. There was no mercy in their hearts. And honestly, given the Mongols' record across Central Asia, can you blame them? Historical sources estimate over 15,000 Mongols died in that valley. 15,000 out of 30,000, a 50% casualty rate. In military terms, this wasn't defeat. It was annihilation. Hundreds of Mongols were captured alive, and Khwarazmian forces executed them by hammering stakes through their ears. It's a gruesome detail, but it tells you everything about the rage and trauma these people carried. This wasn't just about victory. It was vengeance. Shigi Katuku managed to escape with the remnants of his force. Imagine his position. The adopted son of Genghis Khan, given command of 30,000 elite warriors, now fleeing after losing half his army to a prince everyone thought was finished. The shame must have been unbearable. But Jalal had done the impossible. He had defeated the Mongols in open battle, and he knew it. According to the chronicler Ibn al-Athir, Jalal sent a message to Genghis Khan himself. The exact words were, "In which locality do you want the battle to be, so that we may make our way to it?" Can you imagine the audacity, the sheer brass of this man? He had just crushed a Mongol army and was now literally asking Genghis Khan where he wanted to fight next. The news spread like wildfire. Word of the victory at Parwan reached every corner of what had been the Khwarazmian Empire. For a brief, shining moment, the Mongols, unstoppable across half the known world, had met their match in a valley carved by mountains and defended by a prince who refused to fight on the enemy's terms. Cities that had surrendered to the Mongols suddenly found their courage. Envy rose in rebellion, led by a commander named Kush Tegan Palawan, had expelled its Mongol garrison. Even Bokhara, which had long been considered subdued, saw uprisings in the streets. For the first time since this nightmare began, people believed that maybe, just maybe, the Mongols could be stopped. The idea that their empire was not invincible, that the thunderous Mongol cavalry could be defeated, spread like wildfire through Central Asia. News of Jalal al-Din's victory at Parwan inspired a wave of hope that would ripple across the mountains and valleys. If you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval military history, do me a favor and drop a like on this video. It helps the algorithm share stories like this. Honestly, these tales deserve to be told. We spend so much time talking about Mongol victories, but it's easy to forget that they were not, in fact, invincible. For a brief, shining moment, the Mongol war machine had met resistance, and it had bled. But here is where the story takes its tragic turn. And I mean tragic in a way that keeps you awake at night thinking about what could have been. Jalal al-Din had just pulled off the upset of the century. He had united fractious tribes and professional soldiers into a coherent fighting force. He had outthought the Mongols, leveraged terrain perfectly, and struck decisively. He had achieved the impossible. And then he threw it all away over the stupidest possible reason. That evening, as his forces celebrated and divided the spoils of battle, an argument broke out. The center of the dispute was a white horse, a Mongol horse, probably a fine specimen, captured during the chaos. Both Amin Malik, Jalal's father-in-law and the Turkish commander, and Sif al-Nigra, the leader of the Afghan contingent, wanted it. On any normal day, this could have been resolved with a quick decision from Jalal or a private negotiation. But Jalal made a critical mistake. He sided with his father-in-law, Amin Malik, and in front of the entire army, struck Iger with a whip. Let me be clear, this was not a minor insult. In the warrior cultures of medieval Central Asia, it was the ultimate humiliation. Igor was a commander who had just held his position against a Mongol cavalry charge. His men had died following his orders, and now he was being whipped like a common servant in front of thousands of witnesses. Pride, honor, and the fragile cohesion of a coalition army, all was undermined in a single moment. That night, the consequences were catastrophic. The 30,000 Afghan warriors, enraged and humiliated, quietly left camp. They lit fires to make it appear as though they were still there, a deceptive tactic, and by dawn, they had vanished completely. Jalal woke up to a shocking reality. He had just lost half his army overnight. Let that sink in. He had achieved one of the greatest victories of his life, dealt the Mongols their worst defeat in 15 years, and now half his army was gone because of one horse and one moment of wounded pride. This is one of those moments in history that infuriates modern readers, not as historians, but as human beings. Jalal had a single, simple job: keep the coalition together. He had just proved that the Mongols could be beaten, that resistance was possible, that hope could survive in a land dominated by terror. And yet, through poor judgment and failure to manage egos, he jeopardized everything. Leadership is not just about tactics and strategy. It is about people. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought in your own camp, controlling ambition, anger, and pride. Meanwhile, Jalal knew exactly what this loss meant. He understood the consequences of having only half of his army intact. Genghis Khan would not forgive a defeat, especially not one so humiliating. The Mongol response would be swift, brutal, and overwhelming. Jalal had no illusions. He could not stand against a full Mongol army with only 30,000 men. He made the only decision he could. He gathered the remaining forces, rounded up as many refugees as would follow him, and began retreating east toward the Indus River. India offered the hope of sanctuary beyond the reach of the Mongol army. Perhaps there he could regroup and survive. But survival would not come easily. Genghis Khan had received the news of Parwan, and chronicles describe him as furious, not just angry, but in a rage that could topple mountains. This was a man whose empire had been built on the assumption that resistance was futile. His reputation for invincibility was absolute, and now a refugee prince had handed him his worst defeat in 15 years. The humiliation could not stand. Genghis immediately abandoned whatever campaign he was pursuing and personally led his forces south toward Afghanistan. When he arrived at the battlefield of Parwan, the scene was grisly. The valley was littered with the bodies of 15,000 Mongol warriors, a casualty count that spoke volumes about the intensity of the defeat. Medieval chroniclers record that Genghis called Shigi Kutuk to him and remarked, "You did not know the place of battle, and you were both at fault." Both at fault, meaning Shigi and the terrain itself. It was a philosophical observation as much as a critique. Genghis understood that Shigi had not merely been beaten by Jalal's skill, but by the landscape, which negated the advantages of Mongol cavalry and turned mobility into a liability. What makes Genghis truly formidable is what happened next. He did not execute Shigi Kutuk. He did not strip him of rank or punish him out of spite. Instead, he turned the disaster into a learning opportunity. Genghis walked Shigi through the battlefield, showing him exactly what had gone wrong, how Jalal had exploited the terrain, and where the Mongol formations had been vulnerable. In essence, it was a masterclass in military strategy, delivered by history's greatest conqueror. The tuition was paid in the death of 15,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, Jalal al-Din's column struggled eastward. His convoy included not only soldiers but thousands of refugees, families, children, and elderly people who had fled Parwan and its surrounding regions, believing India might be a place of safety. Their presence slowed the march dramatically. What should have been a rapid retreat became a slow, arduous migration. Every step forward was hampered by the need to protect civilians, distribute food, and maintain order in a terrified mass of humanity. Behind them, the Mongols were coming, and this was no ordinary pursuit. The Mongols could march over 100 kilometers in a single day when driven, and they were driven now by vengeance, humiliation, and the absolute certainty of empire. Jalal's column, burdened with refugees and weary from battle, struggled to maintain even half that pace. The math was brutal. The Mongols would catch them if they did not find a defensible position. And soon, The nightmare of Parwan had not ended. It was only shifting into its next, more desperate phase. The story of Parwan is one of audacity, genius, and devastating human error. Jalal al-Din had beaten the Mongols in one of the most improbable victories in medieval history. Yet, a failure of leadership at the very moment of triumph nearly erased it all. It is a vivid reminder that war is never only fought with swords and arrows. It is fought with judgment, diplomacy, and the management of human pride and fear. One small decision, a whip, a word, a choice, can undo years of planning, blood, and brilliance. And so Jalal fled. But even in retreat, his victory at Parwan would resonate for generations. It proved that the Mongols could be defeated, that the legend of invincibility had cracks, and that a clever commander using terrain, discipline, and timing could turn the tide against the greatest army the world had ever seen. But it also stands as a cautionary tale. Victory is fragile, and in the unforgiving world of medieval Central Asia, even the smallest mistake could transform triumph into tragedy. The Mongols could move 100 kilometers a day when they needed to. Jalal's column, burdened with refugees, was lucky to make half that. The math was simple and brutal. They were going to get caught. The only question was where the final confrontation would take place. It happened on November 24th, 1221, on the banks of the Indus River near what is now Kalabag in modern Pakistan. Jalal al-Din had almost made it. The river was right there. India lay on the other side. Safety, freedom, and survival were within reach. Yet the Mongols arrived first. This time, Genghis Khan himself was in command. No more B-team generals. No inexperienced scholars trying their hand at battle. The Khan's presence alone transformed the encounter. He deployed his forces in a massive crescent formation that pinned Jalal's army against the river. On the Mongol flanks, Genghis positioned his sons, Shadatai and Ogidi, giving them command of the wings. Genghis himself controlled the reserve, positioned with deadly precision to cut off any potential escape route. It was textbook Mongol warfare executed by the master strategist who spent decades perfecting every aspect of combat. Jalal al-Din formed his remaining 30,000 troops with their backs to the river, a natural defensive barrier, but also a potential trap. He commanded the center with his 5,000 best warriors, men loyal to him through every trial. Amin Malik, his father-in-law, led the Turkish cavalry on the right. The remnants of the Afghan forces, the survivors of Parwan, held the left, probably under the command of Tamer Malik. It was a strong defensive arrangement, but everyone there understood the brutal reality. This was a last stand. The battle began at dawn. The Khwarazmian left held against repeated Mongol charges, fighting with the desperation of men who knew there was no retreat. For a fleeting moment, it seemed another miracle might be possible. Ogidi's forces on the Mongol left were actually driven back initially. Hope flickered. But Genghis Khan had learned his lesson from Parwan. Seeing the strength of Jalal's position on the ridge, he dispatched an elite unit under a general named Bela to scale the heights and attack from above. Geography, which had favored Jalal at Parwan, now worked against him. The flanking maneuver broke the Khwarazmian line. Tamer Malik fell in the fighting, and the formation began to collapse. Jalal al-Din, witnessing his army disintegrate around him, made a decision that would become legendary. He turned his horse toward the swollen Indus River, raging from recent rains. The river was at least 20 feet below the bank, deep, fast, and unforgiving. Mongol arrows whistled around him. Men shouted for him to stop. And yet, Jalal al-Din, the last sultan of the Khwarazmian Empire, did the unthinkable. With horse and rider, he leaped from the bank into the churning water below. The current grabbed him and carried him downstream, but by sheer force of will and luck, he reached the far bank alive. What floors me about this moment is the reaction of Genghis Khan himself. The man who had crushed armies, razed cities, and destroyed empires stood on that riverbank and watched an enemy perform what looked like a suicide leap to freedom, according to multiple historical accounts. He turned to his officers and said, "A father should be happy to have such a son." That was respect. That was the acknowledgement that even in defeat, a warrior could inspire awe. Jalal al-Din had lost the war, lost his empire, and lost everything materially. But he had earned something that few men in history ever received. Genuine admiration from one of the greatest conquerors the world had ever known. Parwan and the subsequent battle at the Indus River illustrate a simple but powerful truth about warfare. No army, no matter how unstoppable, is truly invincible. Parwan was the only significant defeat the Mongols suffered during their entire Central Asian campaign. Every other battle, every other siege, every other engagement they had won. The battle stands alone as proof that strategy, knowledge of terrain, and disciplined execution could counter even the most fearsome army in history. Jalal al-Din demonstrated three critical elements that most armies of the period lacked: superior understanding of terrain, the discipline not to fall from Mongol feigned retreats, and the courage to stand and fight when others would flee. Yet here is the tragedy. He won the battle but lost the war. The reason was not military. It was political. The White Horse Incident, the argument over pride and wounded ego, caused 30,000 Afghan warriors to desert. That loss of manpower ended any hope of sustained resistance against the Mongols. If Jalal had maintained his coalition, if he had managed the fragile alliances within his own camp with even half the skill he showed on the battlefield, history might have been very different. Could he have rallied additional forces? Could he have made the Mongol conquest of Central Asia so costly that Genghis Khan reconsidered? The possibilities haunt historians to this day. Jalal al-Din survived for another decade, wandering across Persia, Azerbaijan, and Anatolia. Sometimes he acted as a military commander, sometimes as a refugee fleeing from the same forces that had destroyed his empire. He never reclaimed his throne. In 1231, he was killed, probably by Kurdish villagers, though the details remain murky. His army survived in fragments as the Khwarazmian mercenaries, who fought across the Middle East for years afterward. But the dream of a free Khwarazmian Empire died with him. The terrain of Afghanistan, however, continued to tell the story of resistance. Those same mountains would later challenge the British in the 19th century, the Soviets in the 20th, and coalition forces in the 21st. Parwan proved that dominance was not just about numbers or technology. It was about knowing the land intimately, choosing the battlefield, and refusing to give up. Geography and human determination together could level the playing field against the seemingly unstoppable. The lessons of Parwan are enduring. No force is truly invincible. Every giant has a weakness. Every empire has limits. But victory alone is meaningless if you cannot maintain the loyalty and cohesion of your people. Sometimes, the most critical battles are not against the army before you, but within your own ranks. Pride, ego, and disunity can undo even the greatest victories. Jalal al-Din's story reminds us that leadership extends far beyond tactics. It requires wisdom, patience, and understanding of human nature. I want you to imagine that moment. Jalal al-Din, last of his line, makes a desperate leap across a raging river, while arrows scream past him. Behind him, half his army has deserted. Before him stands the greatest conqueror in history. Yet Genghis Khan stops and acknowledges his courage. The sheer audacity of that moment is breathtaking. It is a reminder that even in the face of total defeat, bravery and ingenuity can earn respect. So, what's the ultimate takeaway from Parwan and the Indus River? Perhaps it is this: no power is invincible, no empire eternal. Preparation, terrain, courage, and unity can allow the smallest force to achieve the impossible. But even the greatest victories can be undone by failures of leadership, by unchecked pride, or by disunity. Jalal al-Din showed the world that Mongols could be beaten. He proved that giants could fall. And even in defeat, he showed that honor and bravery can outlast conquest. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Could Jalal have won the war if he had kept his coalition intact? Was he a brilliant strategist undone by politics and ego? Or was his fate inevitable given the overwhelming force arrayed against him? History doesn't give easy answers, but debating them keeps these lessons alive. If nothing else, Parwan and the Indus River are reminders that history is not just about victors and losers. It is about courage, ingenuity, and the human spirit resisting against impossible odds. On September 1221, in a narrow Afghan valley, 30,000 Mongols marched in. 15,000 never marched out. It was the day the unstoppable force stopped. The day one man proved even giants would fall. The day Afghanistan showed the world the power of knowledge, courage, and resolve.